All right. Welcome, everyone. We're just getting set up, getting ready to go for our first show. Excited to have all of you here and hear your thoughts on what we're reading today. So just give a couple more minutes for other people to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. Well, welcome to our first episode on the Startup Growth Club. We're a group of startup founders and teams who want to learn more together about how to be successful. My name is Justin. I'm the founder of UpFocus, and UpFocus is the missing workflow for deciding which uncommitted ideas will have the most impact on keeping your happy customers happy and converting your on-the-fence customers into happy ones. Today, we're going to talk about the book we're reading, Hacking Growth. We're reading this in 4 parts, 1 per week. And every Friday, we're going to do a discussion show just like this one. And then on Tuesday, May 31st, one of the authors, Sean Ellis, is going to join us for an Ask Me Anything, which I'm really excited to be able to have not only a group discussion of learning together, but then get a chance to actually talk to the author about it. So before we get started, let me just share a few housekeeping items. First, if you're enjoying today's show, then please help us share it with more people. Ultimately, we want to be able to help more people learn with us and get the word out. And so what we're going to do is, if there's something that you find interesting, if you wouldn't mind just sharing with your friends and your network on Twitter or LinkedIn, and then just go ahead and use the hashtag that you see in the lower left corner. Let me point it out to you here. All right. So we're going to actually read those. So anything that you share, we're going to go back and read those. Sean's going to read those, and they're going to help us learn what people find interesting. And then we'll include some of those in our write-up blog post. Also, today's show is really all about you and what you're taking away from Hacking Growth. And we want you to add to the discussion, which you can do with chat, or even better, you can raise your hand and you can join me on screen and share your thoughts. I'll show you how you can do that. If you're new to using Zekin, there's a button just like you would see in Clubhouse where you can raise your hand. It's the red one in the lower right corner. So you raise that hand, and then I can bring you up on stage, and then we can all chat together and hear your thoughts. And I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, because that's what this show is all about, being able to learn together. Also, if you are interested in joining us as a discussion in between, we are going to be doing that on Goodreads. We have a discussion channel there, and we'll go ahead and post the link in the chat so you can see, what the discussion is sort of in between each week. And also, if you want to be able to join us for the upcoming shows, we're going to use, would also drop in the chat an add to calendar option. And that add to calendar option is something that will automatically pop up on your calendar with the correct link to be able to come and join us for the show. This is just part 1 of a 4-part series. And then on the 5th show, like I said, we'll have Sean join us for an Ask Me Anything. So if you want to be reminded of these events, go ahead and click that add to calendar. And finally, we're also going to be broadcasting this on YouTube so that we can record that, and we'll share that with you, on our Twitter channel and LinkedIn. But I went ahead and put the link here into the channel. And so this allows us to be able to share those with you. So if you want to go ahead and subscribe to that, go ahead and we'll share those with you. Okay. So with the housekeeping out of the way, let's dive in. Okay. So, um, hacking growth is a practical guide on how you can crank up growth and drive success. And the author, Sean Ellis, has turned multiple companies into billion-dollar companies, including Dropbox, LogMeIn, and Eventbrite, and others. In fact, Sean is credited with coining the term growth hacking. His co author, Morgan Brown, has also been a part of growth teams for billion-dollar companies, such as Facebook and Shopify, where he's currently the VP of growth. So, in other words, these guys know what they're talking about when it comes to growth. And I have to tell you, before I read this book, I actually thought growth hacking was just a marketing thing. Um, and so it was really interesting to me to learn that actually these are cross functional teams. And in fact, when they're talking about it in the book in chapter 1, and they're naming the different people who are going to participate in the actual team, they almost sort of say the marketing member is nice to have. We recommend that you have them, but almost optional, as compared to engineering and a data analyst, which are described as cornerstones. So I thought that was really interesting. And I wanted to hear what some of your thoughts are on the growth team being something that is cross functional. And so here's a chance for you to be able to raise your hand and participate and share some of your thoughts on, you know, what did you think learning that this is actually a cross-functional effort and not just a marketing effort? Awesome. I see a few of you weighing in here on the channel, on the chat. And if you want to participate by sharing some of your thoughts, then just go ahead and hit that button in the lower right corner that allows you to raise your hand. And while some of you are doing it, I'll share some of my thoughts as we wait for some of you to be able to join us here. One, you know, when you get a cross-functional team together, it can be a challenging to actually make that happen, right? You need executive buy-in. It has to be something that's really driven from the top down. And I don't know how many of you have actually had a chance to be able to get that kind of a team set up in your companies. Um, but it's definitely the kind of thing that you can't really just decide to do without the blessing of the team at the top, because you are essentially taking some of those resources from different departments, and making it so that you're kind of taking away from some of their other priorities. um, Hard to say that that's a bad thing when in fact that's going to be all about driving growth. So have any of you actually had a opportunity to be able to, set up a team like this? Would love to hear what you have to say about it. I'll give us a nice little moment of pause. All right. Also curious, when they talk about how the team operates, they share some of the ways that you work in a bit of a sprint like cycle. And I was curious if you had, when you were reading it, any sort of questions or insights about how a growth team operates, or maybe you've set one up yourself. All right. Uh, I see some folks in here weighing in on the chat. Looks like Josh is saying definitely helpful. Implemented a traction team last year after moving from a hub and spoke model to siloed departments. So it feels like some of this would take some of that departmentalizing and siloing down. Yeah, I agree. Daniel, looks like you've got a good question here in the chat. Who has tried, and what challenges have you run into? And curious if any of you have thoughts that you'd share on ways that you've tried or challenges that you'd run into. I want to share that with the group. And hey, I'm having a fun time being up here chatting with all of you. I'd love to have some of you join me if you want to go ahead and hit that raise your hand button, that red button in the lower right corner. All right. Thanks, Daniel. Let me get you up on here. Hey, sir. Welcome to the show.
What up? What up? Guys on the inner tubes.
That's right. So, what are your thoughts about sort of getting a team structured or questions that you might have?
Well, I haven't really. I think I've seen failed attempts at forming growth hacking teams and having them be successful within an organization. And so it sounds great to me in theory. And I think that, like, it seems like in 10% of scenarios, it can work really well. But such is the nature of experimentation that it's not going to work really well all the time.
Yeah.
And so, the tension of the executive going out on the limb to make a case for, hey, we need a growth team that can kind of just uh, you know run with a lot of latitude across the whole organization, and that kind of being a net good thing for the whole organization. Um, I think obviously there's a lot of nuance probably that I'm missing, that someone with a lot of deep experience inside of an organization that's done this, um, has more clarity on. But that's just kind of my reaction to reading how growth hacking even comes about.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, I'd love to learn more. How do you actually get the buy-in? How do you actually, get the team to be able um, to agree that this is something that you should do, and sort of how do you build the business case? I think that would be a lot of interesting nuance to learn.
Yeah. I think another iteration on it too is empowering teams to be more, growth hacky in their own right, and thinking in terms of, kind of leverage points and the ROI on different leverage points. I really like and this is, I'm reading on Kindle, and when I do highlights and it syncs to Goodreads, it doesn't tell me which chapter it is. So I don't know if this is first chapter or second chapter, but I really like this point that growth teams should be involved in all stages and all levers of growth, from attaining product market fit to customer user acquisition, activation, retention, and monetization. And so I think that's a little bit more of an argument for, like, more teams can participate in growth hacking with the proper mindset, because it's going to be inefficient to have one team work across, kind of all aspects of the customer lifecycle, unless it's a small company.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah. Yeah. It's super interesting. Thank you for sharing those thoughts, and want to give you the opportunity to weigh in some more on some of these in the future. So if you do, you'll raise your hand again, and then love to hear more of what you had to say.
okay, so I get kicked out now, and then I'm placed
You,
back in the queue. Is that
you
how the
get kicked
software
out
works?
now. That's right.
Okay.
Thanks, Daniel. All right. Thank you, Daniel, for some of those thoughts. I just kind of moving the discussion forward here. Another thing I thought was interesting was choosing the right structure for your growth team at the organization. And the two sort of big things are: is this something that's permanent or temporary, or is this a product led group or an independent group? And just curious if you had some thoughts about the type of structure that might be right at your organization, or if you had questions about, what type of structure might be right for your organization. Looks like maybe no questions on the structure. We know exactly what to do. All right. Yeah, I kind of feel like one of the key insights was that a permanent team is one that seems like the right thing, because ultimately you can make a great product, get some momentum, but then lose it. Um, and whenever you're doing a temporary one, I think that's when some of the buy-in gets more challenging, and the feeling of, oh, you're disrupting resources. So if possible, it seems like a good commitment is make a permanent team. And I don't know if you've seen this in your organizations or sort of had thoughts on it, but love to hear more from you. If you hit the lower right corner, that raise your hand button, I'd love to bring you up and hear what you have to say. What I have to say is only somewhat interesting. What you have to say is much more interesting. All right. How about a more open-ended question? What? Oh, hold on. We got Vince here. Vince, let me bring you up.
Not sure I
Hey,
want this
Vince.
cap on though. Cap, it's a tough year, I'll tell you.
Yeah, I understand. Hey, Vince, good to see you, man.
Yeah. Well, I haven't cracked the book. I just ordered it. I
Yeah,
just discovered this morning. But
perfect.
as most things that you want to gain momentum on that include a lot of unknowns, how do you protect it? You make it important, you protect it out, and you iterate on it. And
Yeah,
short feedback loops and a consistent team. I mean, it seems like a pretty tried and true formula for these kinds of things.
yeah. Have you had an opportunity to work on a growth team or you know, observe one?
But it is something I am considering, both in my
Yeah,
current role and something that I want to be considering as a part of my future.
yeah, that makes sense. I know you happen to know you personally, so I know you have a background in engineering. Um, and I found it interesting in this book that I always thought growth hacking was just a marketing thing.
Right.
Did you know that it was a cross-functional
You
type of
know,
effort?
it didn't necessarily dawn on me. I do remember the part of the reason that I thought it was had a similar poorly informed notion was because the only experience I had had with it was this idea generation exercise was,
Mm,
it was coined as, hey, let's do this growth hacking exercise rather than it
mm,
being, let's have a growth hack investment, which
yeah,
is really, I think, what you need to do. It's not brainstorming ideas. Um,
yeah.
so that was my previous exposure, and that's what drew me in when I saw it on LinkedIn this morning and got me on this in a very impromptu fashion.
I love it. I love it. I appreciate you joining. But if you have some more thoughts, feel free to raise your hand again, and
Sure.
love to have you back up. All right. You can't have a show for the first time and not make some mistakes, like removing your own self from the show. So, check. Did that. Okay. Um, let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the things that you highlighted in the book. I don't know about you. I did a physical copy, so I've highlighted a bunch of things. Um, in particular, I'd be curious if you had highlights from chapter one, if you found any particular parts either interesting, insightful, or that you had questions about. Would love to hear what you thought about just setting up the growth team and maybe the roles or responsibilities that people had. And I'll look for some that I thought were pretty interesting while maybe you take a moment and look through your highlights. Yeah. In fact, this is the one that I thought was interesting because of my preconceived notion about what growth hacking was all about. Um, this one on the marketing specialists. While we should be clear that some growth teams operate without a dedicated member who is a marketing professional, we advocate including a marketing specialist for optimal results. So it seemed interesting to me that that was not a given that in growth hacking, you're of course going to have somebody from the marketing team involved. Um, obviously, they're advocating for it, but contrast that to software engineers and data analysts when they're considered, cornerstone members. Adam, all right, let me get you up here.
Yeah.
Hey, Adam.
Yeah, so on that same topic, the one time I have been at a company that has attempted to have a growth team, it's they hired an individual to be the lead of that team, and
Outside of the company, or just
yes,
made
yeah,
that
outside of the company, and we were about 50 people at the time, so still pretty early, really.
Yeah.
Like the product team only had a couple of people. It was still forming into like separate product areas. And the person we hired was like former, like had started multiple startups, like definitely had
Some
the skill
experience.
set to be able to do it, right?
Yeah.
They were hired into the marketing department though, so that might have been mistake one. I mean, I think that maybe I wasn't part of like deciding to hire this team.
Right.
But maybe they made some assumptions, like it sounds like you did, and I think I probably have too, that like marketing of course is going to be part of this.
And the lead, right?
Yeah, right, yeah. But I think the biggest problem was there was not a dedicated engineer. So it was like a slice of an engineer. I'm not sure how much, or like per project, maybe. Like it was like, okay, now we have a growth project. What engineer can we find that has some cycles, right? And
Right.
And then also with the product team still forming, really, there wasn't that, like it formed a few months later, and so then it was like, oh, now we have to change our approach because now there's all these different product teams, and so then it kind of became a like the growth lead would go to one product team at a time. So neither of those approaches really are what is being recommended in the book, right? Like
yeah,
I mean, kind of ad hoc and like half committing.
Yeah. Somebody outside of the company, and then also like one of the roles that's considered cornerstone, the engineer, being sort of fractionally involved.
Yep.
Definitely sounds like sort of against the grain of the advice from those who've actually been quite successful at making this happen.
Yep. Yeah. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, it was one of those, like a startup person who isn't able to go at startup speed, which is kind of the idea of a growth team, right?
Right.
Got bored and left. So, yeah.
Wow. Not to put you on the spot, but just curious if there were other parts that you sort of highlighted in chapter 1 or even chapter 2.
Yeah, I mean the team was the big aha for me too, which it sounds like kind of has been across the board, and is probably the biggest struggle that I would see any of my clients who are typically marketing departments. So being able to implement is just that they don't always have the control over those areas, or an ability to make any of those changes, right? So I think that was the biggest takeaway for me at the start of the book. And kind of my open question is, I wonder if there are ways to be able to show some progress, so that then you could maybe make the argument that there should be this separate team. Like I think that's a big hurdle to overcome, right? To get to we need multiple people to be able to be assigned to this,
right?
So that's the other kind of open question I have in my head as I'm going through. I think the other aha for me was, I think in chapter 2 was, and this is something I've heard in A/B testing before, but just like making big changes, like, and I think that's maybe another misconception that growth hacking is this like, oh, if we move the button a centimeter to the left, will more people click it, right? If we change the shade a little, right? That sort of like really tiny changes. And I thought breaking down those numbers was really helpful to see that when you have smaller changes, you need to wait longer and have more people to be able to know whether they're successful. which I know is a sort of classic A/B tests thing. But to think of this that way, and to have that be the reason to make a big change, to aim for testing something big rather than testing something small.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in that. I love your example of, did you just change the color of the button and that somehow drove, a huge difference? And it really has to be, a change in positioning, or, a wholesale layout change, or, something much more substantial. I thought that was really, really helpful. Good examples in there, good numbers, drive home that point. So awesome.
Cool. It's been fun to read.
Yeah. Thank you for joining me. And I'm going to ask a few more questions. So if you want to come back up, raise your hand again, and would love to hear more of your thoughts.
Sounds good. Thanks, Justin.
All right. Thanks. Okay. So looking back here at my notes. So kind of moving into a little bit more of chapter 2, I'm curious what you thought about determining if your product is a must-have before you actually start in on growth. It might be something that maybe seems incredibly obvious, but I thought it was a really excellent breakdown on, how to determine if your product is a must-have, but also that it's really a requirement that it's in that place before you start growth efforts. So I don't know if any of you have seen companies who've, attempted to try to really pour the gasoline on the growth engine, before it's actually an engine, or examples or questions that you have about sort of how you actually determine if it's a must-have. But I found that part to be particularly interesting, and would love to hear from any of you. If you just click that lower right button with raise your hand, and hear some of your thoughts on the need to know, is this thing a must-have before you actually start in on growth? If you haven't weighed in before, love to hear from you. If you have weighed in before, love to hear from you again. And while we wait, I'll share some of the things that I thought were particularly interesting about running the actual must-have survey. And that was, essentially the way Sean initially discovered this concept for, instead of asking people directly, is this product a must-have? It was this, flipping the question, right? How would you feel if you could no longer have this product? And then knowing, is that going to make you very disappointed, somewhat disappointed, or not disappointed, or not relevant because I'm not using the product anymore. And that's really a powerful measure for being able to understand, what do people actually think about your product. And it looks like, Luciano, I've got you up here, and so I'll bring you up, and then Josh, I'll bring you up next. Hey, Luciano, welcome to the show.
How's it going? Yeah, appreciate it. I like hearing stuff like this, especially being able to kind of understand, the finer details of growth, especially in my position. As a CEO, we are product, like supplements and technology, right? And bridging those gaps, I think your software will help me have a better understanding, because salespeople, we're kind of like, just do it. And I found that even my marketing team is like, hey, let's do these commercials, and let's do all of this, and let's do all of that. And I've been talking to you for a while, and I'm like, well, actually, let's wait. So I think there is an element of testing that growth market, and seeing like, okay, does the oversaturation of it create the demand of it? For sales and marketing guys, we like hardcore, like push it, right? Where they're talking about, my team's like, okay, we got to shoot a YouTube commercial and we got to do all this. And I'm like, dude, we're like in the middle of redoing all of our packaging and branding. Like, let's get that done. But I guess what I'm trying to decipher and understand, like truly deeply understand, is what actually creates that demand, right? Like, because people have to use it, whatever it is, to get the need. So I am from the school of thought that you have to kind of like push it hard at the start, right?
Right.
And my favorite example somebody told me is, I always say the Uber example, right? Nobody before Uber thought that hailing a taxi, although it might have been annoying, would have been like this convenient to just like order it, from my phone. Uber did that very well, of creating that necessity. So I think there has to be a little bit of a balance in it. I think what we do is we look at it from a monetary perspective and not like a results perspective. And that's what I've had to learn. And you've helped me with a lot over the last few months, is like, okay, these are the things that you can do to still see if this, but where you're actually messing up is you're not quantifying the results. So if you could spend $1 million budget on this one commercial and getting some New Orleans Saints players, but if you have no way, and that before I think that's what I was doing. We were like, okay, we can do all this stuff and we're going to do it. We're going to go, because speed and scale and compound monthly growth rate and all of these like buzzwords. And you're like, yeah, but we missed all of this. So, whatever your strategy is, I think what's more important is, learning how to track that result and implement, so that way it kind of does this and you don't do this or this or this. You want that steady growth. So that's my thought.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. Growth can be such a widely interpretable term, right?
Yeah.
And to your point, you have to have some initial push,
Right.
because how are you going to have anybody to survey to determine if you actually have a must-have product, right? Like, so, I think maybe the nuance is just about how much of your capital, how much of your investment, you're really putting behind that. But there is this initial frenetic energy, momentum required to get to a point where you can even say, is my product ready for, a bigger push? I think that's a key thing that I hear you saying. And then also just knowing, you have to have some validation that you've got your product right before you spend that, maybe the $1 million budget, and get an endorsement from the Saints. So
and I just to really kind of bring it home, like, if you I just never knew the value. Like, I went through like all of these accelerators and they said all these things that I had never heard before. Like, we'll talk to your customers. Well, I don't have any customers. Like, like,
that sounds great. Can you find them?
So there's a balance to it, but I this time when we did it, and while it's working, it's because I've just learned like to say no. So I think I'm starting to lean more towards the like validate in small sample sizes and make decisions from there. And that has really been a testament to our conversations and the support. So I appreciate it.
Awesome. Hey man, thanks for weighing in, and I'll have some more questions. And if you want to get back up here, just raise your hand.
Absolutely.
Thanks, man. All right. Vince, it looks like you're up. You're on deck here.
Yeah, I've got nothing meaningful to add, except, I thought about it a little bit different when we talked about pouring the gas on. It wasn't necessarily, is this needed? But it got me thinking back to your other question about a full team on the growth hacking. And one of the things that I've witnessed in the past is, do we have a shared understanding of what it is that we're pouring the gas on and what it's not? And so that you don't end up selling what you don't actually have.
Yeah.
And committing yourself to things that you don't actually have. And so it got me thinking back to the full team and making sure that they're closely aligned around what is good business in regard to what you've built and what is bad business.
Yeah. That reminds me of something I highlighted that was around the importance of being able to articulate the actual benefit of your product. And, they emphasize in here, you really have to drill down on that and set the right expectation. Um, Otherwise, that's what you're doing is you're making this promise for
Right.
something that you don't have because we have it in our minds that that's, what we should be emphasizing. Um, but it is so critical that you actually understand from the customer's perspective in their words where you're delivering value, and then that's the message that you're going to market with, and that's what you're really selling. And I think that's
Yeah.
the
And
spirit of
stick
what
to
you're
it.
saying. Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks. I appreciate that. All right. Kind of digging in more on that part, I thought that, one of the things that really hit me was this description of the new user experience, or as they call it, the NUX. Um, and it reminded me of something that I've heard Sean say before, which is that, product managers are often more focused on the roadmap than they are on making their first customers experience successful. Um, and that there's a lot packed into that, thought there. But if you're not hyper focused on how your first, your new customers' first experience with you gets them to the point where they get to experience as quickly as possible that benefit that your happy customers tell you. And that's not easy. That's a lot of potential iteration. And, as Adam was pointing out earlier, those could be some big moves. Or, as Luciano was saying around, maybe you have to like completely redo your packaging and branding in order to really get it right. But you have to have essentially your mousetrap dialed, before you really go out there and drive it. And I'm curious, have any of you experienced either trying to do that or, seeing how not having your new user experience dialed in has been a challenge, um, or maybe even in ways where you've seen more of a focus on the roadmap than on the new user experience, or if it struck you in any way like that. And Josh, I know that you were in the queue here earlier, and so we can talk about that one, or we can go back to another one if you want to get up here and share some of your thoughts. Love hearing from all of you, and this is how we learn together. All right, thanks for coming back here, Vince. I'll put you up.
Yeah, my point is less, I guess, focused on the growth hacking part, since I'm just catching up with that. But one of the things that I do find that you talk about moving on to the next item or focusing on roadmap to the detriment of closing the loop on did you hit the mark?
Yeah.
That's something that I've fought my whole career, even not in a growth hacking way. It's
Yeah.
how do you get teams to talk about what does success look like with what we're doing?
Mm-hmm.
What is and how would we observe that? How would we measure that? What's our theory about how that would manifest? Are
Yeah.
we in a way that will allow us to gather that information objectively? And do we look at that? Do we take the time out afterwards to look at that and see what it's telling us?
Yeah.
So I found that just in product development, period, let alone growth hacking. And so it was just my mind was swimming when you started to talk about that, because that's one of the things the drum I've been beating for years.
I love that you talked about the instrumentation part, because that is really important. In fact, they talk about that as a key point of emphasis in chapter 2. It's not enough to just like drop Google Analytics in. Do you have the events identified? Are they actually set up so that they're firing? And really, it's about, can you measure from the point of the first visit all the way through to purchase and then into a successful adoption, which is one part implementation that obviously takes coordination with your engineering team and whomever is going to be helping interpret that analytics. But it's also a thoughtful exercise ahead of time to know, like, what's their actual journey, like what are the things that we need to identify, because otherwise, how are you going to be experimenting and then observing the results, and what metrics are you actually going to be measuring? That's a really big point. Yeah. Well, thank you, Vince. All right. Going back to my notes here. Curious, just generally, were there other parts that you highlighted in chapter 2, or chapter 1, that you found interesting that we haven't covered? And I'll just go ahead and open up some of mine. And in the meantime, looks like we've got Daniel here, so I'll pull you up. Hey, Daniel.
Yo, back again. So I really loved all the examples,
Yeah.
of growth hacking. And because I think that in order to get growth hacking right, I was thinking about this a little bit in the shower. In order to get growth hacking right, the ideation has to be really good around what potential experiments you can run. If you only brainstorm bad experiments, then you can run 100 of them and they're not going to do anything. It's going to be a total big waste. So I'm looking forward to, I think he's going to get into that later in the book. What does good ideation look like around experiments? But even just having the examples as sources of inspiration. And I have an idea for a blog, which is failedgrowthhackingexperiments.com. Because I think there's
I fixed it.
Well, that, but also like in scientific discovery, papers are written and published around, stuff that show, experiments that showed results.
Right.
But, the, 8 out of 10 that don't show any results don't get any, documentation, and no one learns from them. So I think
that's really interesting.
Just as useful would be, here are growth hack experiments we tried, they didn't turn out or produce any results, or they even produce negative results, and thoughts potentially on why that's the case. So
yeah, that's really interesting because, one, if you are thinking of ideas of your own, there's almost this like kind of go and check the library of failed experiments and
for sure,
and see, does my idea is that in there? Which doesn't necessarily mean don't try it, right? Because
it could be try it, because it could be like whatever circumstance caused it to fail the last time might actually not be the case for you.
Right. Yeah. So if they had a little bit of theorizing about why they think it failed, or provided enough context that could help you, that's a really cool idea.
Cool.
Sounds more like a directory. I'm in.
Thanks, Justin.
Yep. All right. Love to hear from all of you if there's other parts that you found particularly interesting, and that you highlighted in either chapter 1 or chapter 2. And go ahead and hit the raise your hand button if you want to be able to weigh in on the conversation. And while you do, I'm going to share a part that I found interesting in chapter 2. In fact, 2 of the ones that I want to share are from that chapter. And this one is, it's entirely possible to launch a product and conclude, because you're experiencing anemic growth, that the product simply doesn't have an aha magic, when in fact, certain users might already be wildly enthusiastic about it. And, to me, this is particularly interesting because it just goes to show how important segmentation of understanding your users is. Because we can oftentimes look at a data set and sort of look at the averages or look at the aggregate and say, oh, this is, really not working. And, there's another example that I've heard Sean say where he was working with a company where their must-have score, which was, the number of people who said they would be very disappointed to lose their software, was only 7%. But then when they dove in and understood that 7% and then focused their customer acquisition to go get more people who looked like that, I believe, if I'm recounting this right, he said within like 2 weeks, the next cohort of people who they had acquired, their must-have score jumped all the way to the 40% mark. And so I just think that concept of making sure that we don't just look at our aggregate and assume failure is a really important one. So that was a key one I wanted to share. I'd love to hear from you, and if there were some other ones that you highlighted that you found interesting, and share with the group and get our joint learning here. And while you're thinking about it, or maybe looking through your highlights, I'll share another one. This is somewhat similar, and I think they're both interesting to me because it just talks about how growth and the secrets to sort of getting and unlocking it can be, elusive. And this one is that sometimes what's holding you back from achieving growth is not a matter of lack of value in the product or service, but rather of how you are communicating that value to existing and potential customers. And that hits home for me right now. Because frankly, with my own startup, I'm experiencing this very challenge, trying to understand how do you communicate the value of what you do in such a way that it makes sense to your customers. And many times we're so close to what it is that we're working on that our ability to sort of articulate it is caught up in all the different things that we understand about it. And it can often be easier for us to explain someone else's product than it is our own, because you can sort of grill them with the 20 questions. And as you're forming your understanding and your mental model of what they're doing, you're not burdened with all of the information that's inside that other person's head. But when it's you and it's your turn, it's really hard to do that, which is why I think it's so important when you're using the that product market fit survey or the must-have survey, that you can get some of that learning and understanding from some of your customers. So that was another one that I thought was, particularly useful. All right. Anyone else have something that they want to share that they found interesting and that they highlighted in either sort of chapter 1 or chapter 2? And I'll look for another good one while we see if you raise your hand, hitting that red button on the lower right corner. Johannes. All right. Let me get you up here. Hey, sir.
Hey, Justin. So I'm just able to join. I wasn't able because I had to go on a VPN that is connected to US. So I'm able to join. But now I have joined.
Yes,
I
welcome.
wanted to continue. Thanks. I wanted to continue on what you just have said about that you have to not only have value, but also being able to communicate it accordingly. And I have marked something that is basically directly connected to that, which is one of the cardinal rules of growth hacking is that you must not move into the high tempo growth experimentation push until you know your product is a must-have, why it's a must-have, and whom it is a must-have. In other words, what is its core value, to which customers, and why. And there's something I call a must-have threshold. And it's not only that it is a must-have in its core value itself, but that you're really able, again, to communicate it. And I think that's the main question here for everyone, to what's the what's kind of a secret sauce or something to figure out how you can communicate your value.
Yeah. It's so tricky. It's so elusive, and it seems like no big deal. And seems like maybe we just make a bunch of headlines and we'll do a multifactorial experimentation and figure out which one's the right one. And it's just not that easy. And it really takes there's as we were talking about earlier in the show, there's some amount of brute force effort you have to put in the beginning just to get it in the hands of customers,
Yeah.
so that you can get enough of them that you can then learn from the ones that are happy and successful. How should I say this? I've been playing it this way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go, please. Yeah.
I think really part of it, and I think you have already talked about it, is the aha moment and the early moment of the aha moment, which is kind of the first step of communicating your value.
Yeah. And that I think you mentioned in the Goodreads discussion group, how can you sort of systematically identify what that aha moment is in your product? And that's definitely one of the ones that I feel like I want to flag and ask Sean to illuminate a little more on that when he joins us on the 31st. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me up here. And if you have any more that you want to weigh in on before we go, just raise your hand again.
For sure. Thank you too, Justin.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Well, this has really been a great discussion, and I appreciate everybody who's shared in the chat and those of you who've raised your hand and joined me up here. I feel like there's more that we could go into. And before we do, I just want to give anyone who had something that they want to share or something they found interesting, just one more opportunity if you want to be able to share that with the group, because we all do learn from each other and the different perspectives. So if you have another thought or another passage that you had highlighted that you want to share, just go ahead and hit that raise your hand button in the lower right corner. I'll bring you up. And while I give people a moment to do that, just a reminder, what we're going to do from here is we're going to start to read now chapters 3 and 4. We'll do the same process where next Friday we'll be back and we'll give everybody a chance to sort of share what they've learned from those chapters. Idea here is we can take a nice casual pace and really spend some time understanding this text, so you just get more out of it than you would just maybe crushing through a book that you might normally do on a vacation or something like that. So knowing how you can unlock what these guys have unlocked to be able to drive multiple billion plus dollar companies could be really, really important for your future success with your startup as well. I certainly know I'm looking forward to learning more of it. Okay. Well, I think that's everything from everyone today. So thank you so much for joining me, and hope to see you again on our next show. All right. Have a good weekend, everyone.